Criminal justice is once again in the spotlight with the sentencing in the PC Andrew Harper case. Um, this case is getting quite a bit of attention. I think there's a few reasons for that. Usually, when a police officer dies in the line of duty, that is newsworthy. But this particular incident was pretty graphic. Um, I remember hearing about it at the time, and it sounded the way it was reported at the time like a hit and run, which was terrible. But only recently has it become clear just how bad this was. So this young police officer who had actually responded to a late call, um, three teenage thieves were prowling around rural Berkshire, and he was responding to the reports of this stolen scooter, I believe. Um, but in their getaway, he was dragged along for about a mile. Now you can imagine the sort of trauma that does to a human body. Um, so this is a controversy around this case. The culprits have been sentenced, but they were charged with manslaughter. That's first controversy. The second controversy is the nature of early release. Now, this case is by no means the worst I've heard. I've heard of other serious crimes getting even more lenient sentences. I don't think this is the worst case I've come across, but it's certainly one of the worst crimes. Like I say, to be dragged along for a mile, and his colleagues had to pick up the pieces literally. Um, so just reading out here from the Daily Mirror, I'll talk a bit about this case and then some of the issues around this because I think there's a number of things we need to look at in order for things to change. The reports by Tom Pettifer and Dan Warburton. PC Andrew Harper's heartbroken mum has welcomed the news his killers could have their prison terms increased. The sentences are to be reviewed by the Attorney General, which Debbie Adlam said is the right thing to do. She added, "We walked out from court feeling so let down. Andrew deserves so much better. We can't bring him back, but we can hope there's something to give him the justice he deserves." And his wife Lizzie has also spoken of her devastation at the outcome. Um, and the report says this: PC Harper's widow, Lizzie, 29, told the Old Bailey how she has been plunged into a lost and endless world of numb despair. I think only people who've went through that sort of trauma of losing a loved one in such brutal circumstances can really know what that's like. Um, PC Harper, 28, was caught in a strap and dragged for a mile behind Long's car after trying to stop the gang taking a stolen quad bike. Excuse me, I said scooter, quad bike in Berkshire last August, so it's about a year ago now. So the three teenage culprits, Henry Long, 19, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole, both 18, were jailed for manslaughter for a crime the judge described as being very close to murder in its seriousness. Long, who drove the car that dragged PC Harper to his death, was sentenced to 16 years, meaning he may be out in less than 11, because the parole board looks at cases after two-thirds of the sentence is up. Cole and Bowers, the passengers at the time, were each jailed for 13 years, so they could be out in 8. Speaking about the killer's joy in court at being convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, Debbie said that was very insulting. To see them jumping and celebrating was hard enough. They got away with it, really. Now, that's a bit that really troubles me. In sentencing, and I know this because it's explicitly stated in the guidelines for the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, judges take into account aggravating and mitigating factors. Now, I would say that in this case, the utter lack of remorse from the three killers is that should absolutely be an aggravating factor. I think that should have elevated this from a manslaughter charge to a murder charge, minimum of 20 years each, to be 20 years each. Um, just looking at their smug faces is enough to make you want to throw up. So even if you think, okay, well, maybe they didn't know they were dragging the victim along, their utter lack of remorse to me really speaks volumes. And I think it's a travesty the judge didn't consider that. To me, it's another example of out of touch judges not really considering aggravating factors. Um, I know there's an online petition. I've signed it. Clearly, that's had some effect. But the thing is, this is only a high-profile case. There are others. And the report also states, I should say, there's an unduly lenient scheme. The Attorney General's office operates a scheme in which people can apply to have a sentence reviewed. I'm not sure who the Attorney General is at the moment, to be honest. It is reserved for the most serious cases, including murder, rape, and manslaughter. Anyone can recommend a sentence be reviewed, even if they aren't involved in the case, and only one person has to ask. The request must be made within 28 days of sentencing. Once the Attorney General's office has reviewed the case, they may send it to the Court of Appeal, who can decide if the sentence should stay the same or be increased. Scheme statistics for 2019 show 63 offenders had sentences increased. In 2019, law officers received 577 applications sentences to be reviewed that met the necessary criteria, and 16 criminals were imprisoned after having avoided prison time at their original sentencing hearing. Um, well, 63 offenders had sentences increased. That means 63 out of touch judges at least. And those are only the cases which were successful. There would have been other applications that didn't pass. I think we actually need to consider a deeper problem here. Which is the legal establishment. I think they're massively out of touch with public anger. Um, and I think there's some ways this can change. Number one, I think that sentencing has to be honest. This travesty of early release, I think the parole board has a lot to answer for. They literally have blood on their hands. When you have cases of uh, an offender who is released early, and then, as we saw from the Fishmonger Hall attack, go on to commit a terrorist attack, the parole board really need to be facing public anger on that. They are the people who make that decision. And there's a lot of passing the buck. Judges say they have their hands tied by sentencing guidelines. The sentencing council say they leave it down to judges. I say both are responsible. And the Tories are supposed to be the party of law and order. They've been in power now for over 10 years, and we still see time and time and time again undue leniency in so many cases. Now, I appreciate that in a democratic system, the government and the judicial system has independence, but I don't accept that the government has no influence on this. Um, I mean, certainly the Attorney General is appointed by the government. There's a lot of other areas I think the government could get more involved. I mean, Johnson and particularly Priti Patel talk tough. And that might even be, I think Patel is sincere. I think she really does want to see better justice. And I accept she can't do everything, but I would urge her to do everything in her power to see the situation change. A sentence has to be honest, otherwise, the public are just going to be in total despair. I mean, the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, I keep mentioning them because they are the people who set the guidelines for judges. I think in Australia they have a policy of minimum sentences. That is actually putting a lower limit on how low down a judge can go. In other words, it forces them to impose meaningful sentences. That sounds like a good idea. I mean, obviously, each country is different, and you're going to have to look at the results of each policy. But that seems to me to be a good way of forcing these judges to issue real sentences. Because they claim to have their hands tied. I don't accept that. I think sometimes judges make ideological decisions not to jail someone or to give them a lighter sentence. I think there's a lot of factors for that. I think sometimes it's the attitude of leniency towards young offenders. I think it's this desire to not jail people because of prison numbers, but prison numbers should not be a reason to allow a dangerous criminal off the hook. The issue around prison numbers, I think, can be addressed by building more prisons. Of course, it would be expensive, I think that, you weigh that up against the cost of reoffending. Think about it. You build more prisons. That eases the pressure on prison staff. It eases the pressure on inmates because rather than having four people in a cell, you have two people in a cell. So it gives them better conditions, thus easing pressures. Um, and I don't know why it hasn't seriously been looked at. Of course, it would be controversial. Wherever new prisons are built, locals probably won't like it. But there has to be a utilitarian point to this, which is wider society. Um, to be quite honest, I wouldn't feel that bad about living near a prison so long as it was secure. I honestly wouldn't feel particularly in danger. Um, they have to go somewhere. So there's a lot of things that I think need to be looked at. Dishonest sentencing is definitely one of them. Astonishingly, the Sentencing Council of England and Wales claims that one of their purposes is to restore public confidence in the criminal justice system. I would argue they've been played a big part in destroying public confidence. Pathetic guidelines. I mean, if you look at the website, they specifically state that they treat young offenders. They look at rehabilitation before punishment. They specifically state that. But we need to change this mentality that a 15 or 16-year-old thug is somehow not responsible for their own actions. Particularly nowadays, cognitive development begins fairly early. You cannot tell me that even a 14-year-old doesn't know right from wrong. There may be some extreme cases where, let's say, for example, the father's a heroin addict, the mother's a prostitute, or the father's an armed robber, the mother's a drug addict. I understand those sort of things can't be ignored, but I still think that in too many cases, we see teenage thugs get a tap on the wrist. That has to change because too many people have suffered from this. I think of another high profile case, Gary Newlove. I think it was Wigan. It was either Wigan or Widnes. It was a town in northwest England back in 2007, beaten to death by yobs because he told them he reprimanded them for throwing stones at his car. Yesterday I was at a coffee shop and I saw these kids running wild in the street. They were trying to barge their way into the shopping centre. They were, I'd say, average between 10 and 15 in age. Um, so there's definitely an issue there with parenting. I think that bad parents need to face really far tougher penalties. Um, but I think the system in general is too lenient. Now, to those of a liberal school of thought who say that tough justice is just revenge. I say it's not. I say it's fairness. Um, and when I talk about fairness and when I talk about proportional sentencing, I'm not talking about throw them in jail and throw away the key. I think that in a civilized society, in a modern country, of course, conditions need to be humane. I don't think we should treat criminals the way they've treated their victims. But there are people out there. There was a piece by a barrister recently in the Daily Express, actually, right wing publication. But his grand idea was to abolish prisons, greatly reduce them, abolish them first of all, and then replace them with much smaller. I think he put it community centres or something. That sort of insane la la land attitude to things is just. Firstly, it's out of touch with with public sentiment. People want more justice, not less. Secondly, it's reckless. It's just reckless. You cannot have a system or you cannot have a situation where dangerous people are just released and then you expect them to go on to some sort of training program or therapy or something and just expect everything to be okay. We have seen cases in recent times of people released early, they go out to commit an atrocity. So I think the Sentencing Council of England and Wales, I think judges, I think the parole board, they all have to answer to public anger. I think there should be a lot more empowerment to the public for judges, holding judges to account. As it stands, if a judge can be disciplined for professional misconduct. Let's say, for example, they're having an affair with one of the jurors, for example, that would be professional misconduct. But there's very, very little power the public has to hold consistently weak judges to account. Okay, they can contact the Attorney General with this unduly lenient scheme, but that's no guarantee of anything changing. It's just a sort of possibility that it could. I think there needs to be a situation where these judges face public anger. And what I mean by that is consider MPs. If you think your MP is useless, you have the power to vote them out of office every 4 or 5 years. Okay, you can write to them. You can go to their constituency surgery. Whether they show up or not is another matter. But if they're incompetent, if they're a lousy MP, you can put that X on the box against their name, vote them out of office. We don't elect judges in this country, and I've mixed feelings whether we should or shouldn't. I can see some problems with that because you might have, for example, judges in a largely Muslim community who might then start to, then Islamist sentiments might demand Sharia law and that sort of thing. So I can see some problems with that. However, what we must have is a situation where the public feel far, far more empowered. As it stands, there is no way to confront weak judges. They have no contact details, so it's not like you can write them a letter of protest, which I, by the way, feel very strongly about. I think that if you're in a position of power, if you are a high level business person, if you're a politician, if you're a judge, if you're a media executive or a celebrity, there has to be an avenue for the public to express discontent with you. And if there is no contact avenue to reach judges, then how can they be accountable? How can they really understand public anger? They might read the papers, they might, but I do think there is a culture here. There's a cultural problem with a massive disconnect between the justice system and the public. Now, the Sentencing Council has this thing about sentencing myths where they try to counter that, but they're ignoring real world examples. They say, for example, all judges are ordinary people and they deal with cases all the time, dealing with these things, but they are ignoring real world examples where there have been absurd judgments. I'll give an example. Um, Not long ago, a judge ruled that a teenage girl who had been rapist got away with it because he argued the teenage girl had dressed provocatively. Now, that sort of attitude, in my opinion, his job should be on the line. There was a case in Newcastle upon Tyne not long ago where a female judge sentenced a thug who had beaten his girlfriend to a pulp to 2 years. This guy had left his girlfriend for dead. So I think we need much, much more accountability for those sort of useless judges. They need to feel public anger. I'm not talking about threats or anything like that. I'm talking about passionate but peaceful anger. You know, why not? Because I really believe this lack of trust in the justice system, that's one factor for it, along with the other things I've mentioned. So I don't know if anything's going to change from this. It's really tragic that it takes something like this to draw attention to it, rather than the legal establishment actually getting its act together and recognizing change has to happen. But I'm not overly optimistic that anything will change because we've seen this before. Time and time and time again, we see these damaging, destructive crimes. We see remorseless criminals. And time after time after time, um, the legal establishment stays the same. Nothing changes. It's rotten. And it infuriates me, to be honest. And I haven't been through anything like what some people have. So I sometimes feel very, very frustrated with this. And like I say, the UK isn't even the worst example. I mean, we don't have a system that is so lenient that, like the Nordic model. which liberals love to hail because, oh, look how low crime is in Norway and Sweden. What I'd like to really hear from is victims of serious crime in those countries. If they're overjoyed with contentment at criminals being treated with cotton wool in those systems. Um, and then you have the other extreme, which is the United States, for example, which I think does jail too many people. Then, of course, you have parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America where prisons are basically like human um, battery farms, that's clearly not a good approach. We don't have the worst system in the world, but there is enough anger out there and enough disillusion out there to demand change. There just needs to be public willpower, and the legal establishment needs to change. It needs to get out of its bubble and start listening to the public. And by legal establishment, I mean the whole damn thing. I'm talking about the parole board, I'm talking about the sentencing council thing in Wales, and I'm talking about judges. There are occasionally judges who make the right call, so I'm not attacking all judges. Some of them get it right, but in too many cases they don't. They are excessively lenient. Has to change. And final word, my heart really goes out to the widow and the family of PC Harper. I can't imagine what they're going through. And to have those killers laugh in court, it's disgusting. So thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.